What if the person you believe you are doesn't actually exist? What happens when Western psychology's deepest insights collide with ancient Eastern wisdom? And how did a quiet moment in a Swiss study unlock a 2,500-year-old secret that could change how we understand the mind itself? In the tranquil stillness of his study in Switzerland, the year was 1939. Carl Jung, the renowned father of analytical psychology, sat surrounded by books, thoughts, and decades of clinical experience. After years spent delving into the mysteries of human consciousness, mapping dreams, symbols, and the very architecture of the psyche, Jung found himself face to face with an ancient truth that defied everything he believed. It was a teaching over 2,500 years old, spoken by the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree in India. The self is an illusion. This was no poetic metaphor. It was a radical declaration that our sense of a fixed, unchanging self is merely a construct. To Jung, who had spent his life defining and exploring the self as the very center of psychological wholeness, this idea was both confronting and captivating. Yet instead of dismissing it, he leaned in. He called Buddhism the most sensible and most direct of all religions. Why? What did Jung see in these ancient teachings? And more importantly, what happens when these two powerful lenses, Eastern and Western, are turned toward the same question? Who are we, really? The answer lies in the tension between their views. This tension doesn't create conflict, but rather reveals a gateway to something deeper. It challenges us to explore not just theories of mind, but living truths that can shift how we relate to ourselves and to suffering. Let's pause and imagine two defining moments in time. First, picture Siddhartha Gautama sitting in deep meditation beneath the Bodhi tree. In the silence of enlightenment, he perceives that the self we cling to is a mirage, a flickering pattern, not a solid being. This moment becomes one of the foundational insights of Buddhism, anatta, or no self. Now leap forward to the early 1900s. Carl Jung, already a celebrated thinker in Europe, is immersed in the development of his psychological theories. His study is lined with Eastern texts. He is crafting his idea of the self as the ultimate goal of individuation, the integration of all aspects of the psyche into a balanced whole. At first glance, these two visions seem to contradict each other. One erases the self, the other builds it, and yet, astonishingly, both have helped people heal, find meaning, and live with greater peace. Both are supported, decades later, by research in neuroscience and psychology. How can that be? To understand, we must follow their journeys. We'll trace how Jung and the Buddha each arrived at their bold revelations. What exactly did they mean by self and no self? And how, rather than cancelling each other out, these ideas can intertwine in surprisingly practical ways, transforming how we deal with pain, identity, and inner freedom. But before we fully enter Jung's world, we must first look further back, to the vibrant, smoky cafes and lecture halls of 19th century Germany. It was there that a brilliant young philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer introduced Buddhist thought to the West. His writings spoke of suffering, of human desire, of the illusions that plague the mind, ideas that would one day deeply influence a young Carl Jung. Jung later wrote that Schopenhauer was the first to speak truthfully about the world's suffering, its chaos, and the emotional storms within. And this early exposure opened a door in Jung's mind that would never quite close. That door opened wider in 1909 when Jung met Richard Wilhelm, a German sinologist and famed translator of Chinese classics. Their friendship blossomed, and with it came a flood of Eastern philosophy that captivated Jung. He began a rigorous routine, rising early, dedicating 3 hours each morning to studying Sanskrit, immersing himself in ancient texts with the mind of a seeker. From 1909 to 1914, Jung's letters began to reflect his growing passion. He wasn't simply reading Buddhism, he was feeling its resonance with his patient's struggles. By the 1920s, his private library had become one of the most extensive collections of Buddhist literature in Europe, including rare Tibetan manuscripts. And this was just the beginning. Jung's journey into the Eastern mind had just begun, but centuries earlier, in a land far from Europe, another seeker had already walked that path and discovered something extraordinary. In the lush, spiritual heart of ancient India, the fertile Gangetic plain, a profound awakening was quietly unfolding. Prince Siddhartha Gautama, after years of spiritual searching and deep inner struggle, finally arrived at a moment of clarity that would change human history forever. Under the shade of the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha's awakening wasn't rooted in theory. It came from direct, visceral experience. What he realized was bold and deeply unsettling. There is no fixed, unchanging self. This wasn't an abstract philosophy, but an insight grounded in awareness so deep that it dissolved the very illusion of identity. Around 485 BCE, at the age of 35, Siddhartha reached enlightenment. In the weeks that followed, he gave his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, at Sarnath, laying the foundation for what would become Buddhist thought. But it wasn't until 5 years later, during a teaching delivered in Varanasi, that he presented one of his most revolutionary insights in full: anatta, the doctrine of no self. This came in the form of the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, a powerful teaching on the impermanence and emptiness of what we perceive as the self. As the centuries rolled on, the wisdom of the East began to make its way west. And during Jung's lifetime, that cultural bridge expanded rapidly. With the rise of steamships and telegraph lines, distant continents were suddenly within reach. Buddhist scriptures, long kept in monasteries and oral traditions, began arriving in Europe in great numbers, translated into English, French, German, and eventually finding their way into Jung's own hands. His personal library in Küsnacht, Switzerland, grew into a treasure trove of Eastern knowledge, filled with texts in Sanskrit and Pali, lined with commentaries, translations, and philosophical treatises from Buddhist and Hindu traditions. But Jung wasn't simply collecting books. He was absorbing ideas, connecting dots, comparing inner maps. While guiding his patients in a quiet Swiss clinic, he began to notice something remarkable. His patients, ordinary Europeans with no exposure to Buddhist ideas, were describing internal experiences that mirrored the Buddha's descriptions of consciousness. In his clinical notes from 1925, Jung observed that this overlap was far too specific to be coincidence. Both he and the Buddha were wrestling with the same fundamental human questions. Why do we suffer? And where does that suffering come from? Their methods may have been different, Jung working through talk therapy and dream analysis, the Buddha through meditation and introspection, but the conclusions they reached were surprisingly similar. Even more striking was how both men endured intense personal crises before arriving at their insights. The Buddha spent weeks in solitary meditation, confronting fear, doubt, and illusion. Jung, during what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, recorded vivid visions, emotional upheaval, and symbolic dreams in what became the Red Book. Each man emerged transformed, but their cultural worlds shaped how they spoke of their discoveries. Where the Buddha spoke of dharma, karma, and dependent origination, Jung used terms like archetypes, shadow, and the collective unconscious. Different languages, but often pointing to the same truths. So what, then, did Jung mean when he spoke of the self? In his groundbreaking work, Ion, published in 1951, Jung laid it out clearly. The self, he wrote, is not just our conscious identity, not the part of us that wears a name, makes choices, or thinks thoughts. Number. It is something far more expansive. The self, he wrote, is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality. The ego, the I we think we are, is merely the center of awareness. But beneath that center lies an immense field of psychological depth. Through years of working with patients, Jung realized that this depth wasn't just filled with forgotten memories or suppressed emotions. It contained something more mysterious, archetypes, ancient, universal patterns that seem to transcend culture and history. And then, something uncanny began to happen. In his personal journals, Jung documented case after case in which patients, without any exposure to Eastern thought, spontaneously created mandalas, circular, symmetrical symbols that closely resembled the sacred diagrams used in Tibetan and Indian spiritual practice. Jung recognized them immediately. To him, these weren't just pretty pictures. They were expressions of the self attempting to emerge from the unconscious. One striking case involved a European businessman who, during a period of deep anxiety, dreamt of a glowing mandala radiating from the center of a dark space. He had no idea what it meant, but Jung saw it clearly. The psyche was trying to heal itself, using a symbol that had appeared for centuries in Eastern meditation. How could this be? How could a modern man with no knowledge of Buddhism access such ancient images? We saw how patients with no knowledge of Buddhism were dreaming of mandalas, symbols identical to those found in ancient Eastern practices. Jung saw this as no coincidence. He believed the psyche itself was revealing something universal, something timeless. One particular dream stood out in his journals, a crystal glowing at the bottom of a deep, dark well. To Jung, this symbolized the self, not the everyday ego, but something far deeper, more enduring. He was struck by the image's similarity to descriptions from Buddhist texts, which referred to the diamond body, a radiant, indestructible essence at the heart of human experience. And yet, the patient had never encountered Eastern philosophy. But for Jung, the self was never a fixed thing. It was always in motion. In both Psychology and Alchemy and his later writings, Jung explained that the self is not a static object to be found or possessed. Rather, it is a living process, a continuous unfolding towards psychological wholeness. He called this journey individuation. What does that mean? It's the process of making the unconscious conscious, of meeting and integrating all the hidden, forgotten, or rejected parts of who we are. Jung didn't invent this idea from theory alone. He observed it again and again in the lives of his patients. The path began with the shadow, those parts of ourselves we deny, suppress, or project onto others. This confrontation was often uncomfortable, but necessary. Next came the encounter with the anima or animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. These archetypes served as bridges to something even deeper. At the end of the path was what Jung called self-realization, a state of inner harmony, where the fragmented parts of the psyche become whole. And this state, he noted, bore a striking resemblance to what Buddhists call enlightenment. To support his insights, Jung didn't rely on speculation. He turned to thousands of dream reports, myths, symbols, and spiritual traditions. He studied alchemical texts and religious scriptures from around the world, searching for recurring images that pointed to the same inner truths. One recurring image was a bright center surrounded by darkness, a glowing core in the middle of shadow. In Tibetan Buddhism, this image appears in mandalas, yet Jung found it in the dreams of patients who had never seen such symbols. He began to believe these were not learned ideas, but archetypal truths woven into the structure of the human psyche. For Jung, the self was both origin and destination. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote that the divine center contains all opposites, light and dark, spirit and matter, conscious and unconscious. It is a paradox, and yet it is real. And as his writings matured, Jung began to speak more openly about the connection between his views and those of the Buddha. In the foreword to D.T. Suzuki's work on Zen Buddhism, Jung acknowledged something remarkable. He called the doctrine of anatta, the Buddhist teaching of no self, one of the most radical propositions ever formulated by the human mind. It wasn't just an opinion. It was a challenge to everything we assume about who we are. This teaching appears in the Buddha's Anattalakkhana Sutta, delivered shortly after his enlightenment. In it, the Buddha directly refutes the prevailing belief in an eternal, unchanging soul. He doesn't argue in the abstract. He uses observation and logic to peel away the illusion of a permanent self. Modern Buddhist scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi echoes this understanding. He explains that anatta is not simply a philosophical concept, it is a tool, a method of insight. It helps us see through the illusion of ego and loosen the grip of attachment. By doing so, we begin to understand the nature of suffering and how to be free from it. But to truly grasp this profound teaching, we need to understand what the Buddha meant by self in his own cultural context. In ancient India, the dominant Vedic tradition taught that each person possessed an eternal essence called Atman, a soul untouched by change or decay. But through deep meditation, the Buddha realized something different. He saw no fixed center, only a flowing stream of sensations, thoughts, and experiences. The self, he understood, was a story, a useful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. To help others see this, the Buddha used a practical approach. He broke human experience into 5 components, known as the skandhas or aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. He taught that none of these, alone or combined, could be identified as the true self. Think of it like this. The Buddha often used the image of a chariot. If you take the wheels, the axle, the frame, and the reins apart, where is the chariot? It doesn't exist in any one part. It's just a convenient label we give to a collection of parts working together. And so it is with the self. Previously, we saw how the Buddha dismantled the illusion of a fixed self by examining human experience piece by piece, showing that no permanent center could be found. Now, we take that insight further. exploring how Buddhist teachings across centuries continued to illuminate this truth with vivid clarity. Just like the chariot metaphor, our sense of self is a convenient label, a useful construction that helps us function in the world. But when we examine it closely, what do we really find? Only a continuous flow of ever-changing processes, no solid core, no unchanging identity. This idea is brought to life in a striking dialogue from an ancient Buddhist text known as the Milinda. In it, King Milinda poses a simple yet profound question to the monk Nagasena. "What is your name?" The monk replies, "Nagasena is just a designation, a term, a name. There is no permanent person here." This seemingly simple answer reveals the very heart of the Buddha's teaching on anatta, or no self. It reminds us that what we call self is, at most, a label for a collection of mental and physical phenomena in constant flux. We encounter another elegant metaphor in the Visuddhimagga, one of the most important texts in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. It compares human existence to the flame of a lamp, appearing continuous, yet constantly changing. Each flicker of the flame looks like the last, but no two moments are ever identical. The text puts it plainly. The being of the present moment lives, but does not proceed to the next moment. In other words, what we perceive as continuity doesn't require an eternal essence. It's simply the mind's way of stitching moments together into a coherent story. And yet, the Buddha was cautious. He never declared there is no self in absolute terms. Why? Because doing so would only replace one rigid belief with another. Instead, he invited us to look, to examine experience directly, and discover that what we call self cannot be found. This subtlety is preserved in the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha's teachings avoid extremes. Rather than dogmatically denying the self, he offered a practical path. Observe the changing nature of mind and body, and let insight arise. This shift in perception transforms how we relate to life. As captured in the Dhammapada, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Far from creating despair, the realization of impermanence and no self brings freedom. It releases us from the exhausting effort of trying to preserve a fixed identity, one that must always be protected, defended, and maintained. This insight runs through many schools of Buddhist practice. Zen masters ask students, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" A riddle that breaks the mind free from conventional identity. In Tibetan practice, one might contemplate, who is it that thinks? A question that doesn't seek an answer, but points toward direct experience beyond concepts. Despite their differences in style, all of these practices aim at one thing, seeing clearly. And what do we see when the illusion of a fixed self dissolves? We see that there's nothing to defend, nothing to grasp. And in that freedom, something beautiful happens. We become more open, more compassionate. By letting go of the self, we become more connected to others who share the same human condition. Importantly, the teaching of anatta does not deny that we have names, roles, or personalities. It doesn't erase conventional identity. Instead, it reveals that these things are constructed, not fixed, not ultimate. This understanding allows us to engage with life more freely and authentically, without being trapped by who we think we should be. At first glance, Jung's vision of the self and the Buddha's teaching of no self seem to point in opposite directions. One builds up, the other breaks down. One affirms, the other dissolves. But when we look more closely, the boundary between them begins to blur. In his later writings, Jung hinted at this hidden harmony. For him, the self was not just another version of the ego. It was a symbol of wholeness, of totality, encompassing all opposites. At its core, he wrote, "It is both everything and nothing," just as the Buddha taught in his own language. And this paradox begins to resolve when we go deeper. Through his clinical work, Jung noticed something remarkable. The closer his patients came to true self-realization, the more their rigid sense of ego began to dissolve. In a private note from 1938, he observed that the experience of the self does not inflate the ego, it softens it. As we move forward, we'll explore how this inner transformation unfolds and how both Jung and the Buddha guide us toward a freedom that lies beyond identity itself. Previously, we explored how both Jung and the Buddha arrived, through very different paths, at the realization that the self, as we commonly know it, is not what it seems. Now, we reach the heart of their convergence, the liberation that comes when we let go of the rigid identity we've always taken for granted. This is where the deepest harmony between Jung and the Buddha becomes undeniable. For Jung, self-realization, and for the Buddha, liberation, though expressed in different languages, both describe the same essential movement, transcending the limitations of the ego. Rather than reinforcing our fixed self-image, both paths ask us to release it. And here lies a powerful truth. Freedom doesn't come from clinging to identity. It comes from loosening our grip on it. Though their approaches differ, Jung through psychology, the Buddha through meditation, both recognize that the ego is at once necessary and illusory. It helps us function in everyday life, but it is not the ultimate truth of who we are. Jung saw the ego as a gateway, a starting point that could, if explored honestly, open the way to greater wholeness. Similarly, the Buddha acknowledged the role of conventional identity in navigating the world, even as he pointed beyond it toward a deeper, unconditioned reality. Both traditions invite us to journey through the self, not to strengthen it, but to see through it. One of the most fascinating bridges between their perspectives lies in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a text that profoundly influenced Jung. He wrote extensively on its psychological relevance, particularly its vivid descriptions of consciousness dissolving into clear light. He noted how this echoed the experiences of patients undergoing deep psychological transformation, those moments when their ego seemed to dissolve into something vast and luminous. What Buddhism calls emptiness, Jung reflected, we might call the ultimate ground of psychic reality. Jung didn't merely observe this in others, he experienced it himself. During his personal confrontation with the unconscious, recorded in the Red Book, he entered states of mind that mirrored Buddhist accounts of shunyata, or emptiness. There were moments when his ordinary sense of self disintegrated entirely, revealing what he called the pleroma, a field of pure potential, beyond all opposites, beyond identity itself. Both Jung and the Buddha understood this. Our ordinary sense of self, while functional, is the root of our suffering. For the Buddha, suffering arises because we cling to pleasure, to control, to permanence, and especially to the illusion of a solid self. Jung, from his clinical perspective, saw that much psychological pain stemmed from the refusal or inability to integrate unconscious material. This inner conflict fractures identity and causes suffering. Despite their cultural differences, Both traditions offer transformative paths. The Buddha presented the Eightfold Path, a guide to right living and deep insight. Jung offered the process of individuation, a psychological unfolding that brings the unconscious into the light and reunites the fragmented self. Another surprising connection emerges in Jung's concept of archetypes. These universal patterns, symbols, and energies that recur across cultures exist independently of any individual ego. They point to a deeper layer of reality beneath the surface of personality. Likewise, in Buddhism, there is Dharma, the fundamental structure of reality, the way things are, whether we see it or not. It's not dependent on personal belief or ego. It simply is. And when we look at the therapeutic practices of both traditions, the similarities continue. Jung's method of active imagination, a practice where one engages the unconscious through visual dialogue and symbolic imagery, mirrors certain Buddhist visualization techniques. Both are designed to soften the boundaries of the ego and allow deeper wisdom to arise. As Jung once wrote after years of studying Buddhist texts, "The East has taught me another, wider, more profound, and higher understanding." He wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was pointing to a real shift in how he saw the human journey, not as a climb toward a stronger self, but as a letting go into something wider than self. We explored how the wisdom of Jung and the Buddha both point us toward freedom, not through ego building, but through letting go. Now we see where their teachings align most clearly, in their shared emphasis on direct experience. Both Jung and the Buddha insisted that true transformation does not come from reading, reasoning, or repeating ideas. Real change comes only when we feel it, when we encounter ourselves in a moment that shakes us, wakes us, and shows us what lies beyond thought. Jung put it simply: the patient must experience something that grips him. Only then can he begin to unlearn his old patterns. The Buddha said the same in different words. Intellectual understanding is not enough. The path must be walked, not just discussed. Whether through meditation, therapy, contemplation, or the challenges of daily life, we must come face to face with our own experience, raw and unfiltered. And when we do, something shifts. We stop seeing ourselves as static beings and begin to witness a fluid, unfolding process. Selfhood becomes something we dance with, not something we defend. In that paradox, that the self is both illusion and essential, we find something remarkably liberating. This synthesis between Jungian psychology and Buddhist wisdom has deeply influenced modern healing practices. Therapists and clinicians across the world are now drawing from both traditions to guide people through personal transformation. One powerful example comes from a therapist working with a patient named Sarah. For years, Sarah struggled with anxiety and a relentless drive to fix herself. But the breakthrough came when she stopped clinging to the idea of a solid self that needed improvement. Instead, she began observing her thoughts and emotions as a flowing process. Her anxiety eased, her perspective softened. She had discovered what Jung described as the self and what the Buddha called no self, not by chasing it, but by letting go. This integration shows up in practical, grounded ways. Take dream work, for instance. Jung's method encourages us to engage with dream figures as symbols from the unconscious, parts of ourselves calling for attention. When combined with Buddhist mindfulness, this becomes even more powerful. Instead of identifying with or rejecting dream content, we learn to hold it gently in awareness, creating space for insight. In contemplative psychotherapy, another example emerges. Here, Jung's concept of the shadow, the repressed or rejected aspects of ourselves, meets Buddhist compassion practices. Patients are encouraged not to fight these parts, but to welcome them. One psychiatrist noted, "When we stop struggling with who we think we should be, integration happens naturally." Jung's technique of active imagination also takes on new depth when paired with Buddhist principles. Rather than striving to strengthen the ego, the practitioner moves fluidly among different parts of the psyche. This brings greater flexibility, emotional intelligence, and wholeness. One long-time meditator described her own shift. "I used to believe I had to become someone better. Now I realize there's no fixed self to improve, just a process unfolding, and all I have to do is trust it." This combined approach is especially helpful for those facing deep identity struggles. Jung's roadmap of psychological growth, enhanced by Buddhist insight, reveals that much of our suffering comes from rigid self-concepts. One case study describes a businessman plagued by workaholism. By reflecting through both lenses, he came to see his obsession with success not as who he was or who he wasn't, but as a psychological pattern. A pattern he could now relate to more wisely, with choice rather than compulsion. Even relationships begin to change under this light. When we no longer grasp at a permanent self or deny our relative roles entirely, we become more present, more compassionate, and more open to true connection. A couples therapist shared that partners who explore both Jungian and Buddhist teachings tend to argue less about who's right and instead become curious about what's real. As we've seen, when we stop clinging to a fixed self, we begin to live and relate with greater ease. But the power of these teachings doesn't end with individual healing or intimate relationships. It reaches far beyond, into the very structures of our communities and collective life. In fact, the convergence of Jungian psychology and Buddhist wisdom is now being explored in broader social contexts, with remarkable results. In organizational leadership, for example, this synthesis is quietly transforming the way leaders lead. Programs that weave together these two traditions help executives and decision-makers navigate authority with clarity and humility. Instead of being consumed by ego or overwhelmed by responsibility, they learn to balance power with presence. One CEO put it beautifully: "Understanding the self as both center and no center paradoxically made me more effective and more humble." It's a shift in orientation, not toward dominance, but toward grounded awareness. Meanwhile, therapists and healing practitioners around the world continue to discover new ways to integrate these insights. Whether in counseling, education, or mindfulness training, the magic is not in choosing between Jung or Buddha, but in allowing both to shine light on the path to wholeness. What once appeared to be a contradiction, Jung's vision of an integrated self versus the Buddha's teaching of no self, now reveals itself as a profound complement. Two voices from different times and cultures, yet united in a shared purpose, to help us see through illusion and return to what is real. Near the end of his life, Jung wrote something striking. The goal of Eastern religious practice is the same as that of Western psychology, the shifting of the center of gravity from the ego to the self and the Buddha. He expressed the same truth in poetic simplicity. like a water bubble, like a mirage. One who sees the world in this way is no longer caught by death. Both remind us that suffering doesn't come from having or not having a self, but from how we relate to our experience. By loosening the grip of identity, we discover something astonishing: the freedom to live more lightly, more wisely, and more compassionately. Jung called it wholeness. The Buddha called it liberation. Two wings of the same bird, each lifting us higher together. So now I leave you with a quiet question to carry into your own reflections. What lies beyond the story you tell yourself about who you are? Take a moment, let it settle, and when you're ready, share your thoughts in the comments below. What resonated with you? What challenged your perspective? Your voice adds depth to this ongoing conversation, and if you haven't yet, join us on this journey. Tap subscribe to stay connected with Buddhism Seeds. Click like if this video offered you insight. Share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Until next time, may your path be illuminated with clarity, grounded in courage, and guided by compassion. See you in the next video.